Hello again, everyone, from the Lubar Center at Marquette University Law School. I'm Mike Goucher, and this is On the Issues. And today we're talking about the significant changes that have occurred in the housing markets in America. So we'll be talking both nationally and locally. We've entitled this program, which will last about 75 minutes or so, Who Owns the House Next Door? And we've called it that because it's an important question right now. There have been many important changes in terms of homeownership in this country since the Great Recession. And we'll be walking through what those changes look like and how they affect neighborhoods and individuals. We're going to be hearing from three people today. We'll be hearing from the Lubar Center's research fellow, John Johnson. John and I have been writing about some of the changes happening in Milwaukee's housing markets. We have seen a significant decline in owner occupancy of single family homes and a big increase in the number of properties owned by landlords who do not live in the city. In fact, many of them do not live in the state of Wisconsin. We'll then be talking with the Milwaukee Common Council President Cavalier Johnson about the city's views of these changes that are occurring, what can and should be done to address them. But we wanted to begin today with Aaron Glantz. Aaron is a senior reporter with Reveal from the Center for Investigative Journalism. He is a prize-winning journalist. He's won a couple of Peabody Awards. He's been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He's written for the Chicago Tribune and the New York Times. Pieces appeared on NBC News, PBS NewsHour. He's had his work in a lot of different places. He's also written several books, and we're going to be talking about this one today. It's called Homewreckers, and this tells the story of the aftermath of the housing crisis that sparked the Great Recession in America. A lot of changes occurred after the Great Recession affecting housing. Some people got very rich. They may have been rich already and they got even richer. But for many middle-class people, working-class people in this country, the changes that we have seen have made it more difficult for them to live out the American dream. And so we'll be talking about all of that with Aaron Glantz, who joins us today from San Francisco. Aaron, we're glad to have you with us today.
It's good to be with you. Thank you for having me.
So in a nutshell, I guess let's begin by talking about what exactly happened. We know that the housing crisis led to the Great Recession, but it also led to this fundamental housing reset in America. What happened, basically?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me. And it's very important that we're having this discussion now when we are once again in the midst of a reset, of a pandemic and sky-high unemployment. And some good things have happened this time, including national foreclosure moratoriums, eviction protections. None of these things happened in 2008. In 2008, 8 million Americans lost their homes. The homeownership rate in America declined every year from 2008 to 2016 until in the final year of Obama's presidency, it hit a 50-year low. And what I wanted to do in writing Homewreckers was find out who won, right? We all know who lost. Millions of American families lost, especially people of color. But who won? And that is what led me to this small group of people surrounding Donald Trump, Steve Mnuchin, our Treasury Secretary, Wilbur Ross, our Commerce Secretary, some large private equity kingpins like Tom Barrack and Steve Schwartzman, the chairman of Blackstone, and also to look at the role of the banks, especially big banks like JP Morgan Chase, in financing all of this. Because we like to think that these rich people who are coming into our cities and buying up homes with cash are buying them with cash, but in fact, they're also financed. They're also borrowing money. They're just doing it through a different system than you and I would.
So walk us through this, Aaron, if you would, how this worked. You had essentially Wall Street investors in many respects buying up foreclosed properties. What was the business model? Why was that so lucrative to them?
Well, I mean, the business model is simple. At that point, homes were worth a fraction of what they had been worth just a few years before. So I write in Oakland of people buying houses that are now worth today, $500,000 or $1 million, buying them for $75,000, right? And just a year or two before, they had been worth $500,000. So there was a crisis, and so they were buying them at a deep, deep discount, but rents never went down. So they could begin making profits, charging rent to tenants almost instantaneously. And other parts of the business model include taking a lot of the responsibility that landlords used to have, like fixing the plumbing, maintaining the lawn, dealing with broken windows, signing lease agreements with tenants that pushed all of those responsibilities off of the landlord and onto the tenant. So they would be putting very little money in on the point of purchase. They would spend very little money maintaining the property. Then they would aggressively increase rent year after year. And then this is the probably a most important point for right now. They would then bundle all of those homes together and create new financial products for mortgage-backed securities, where they take 1,000 homes, 2,000 homes, 3,000 homes, and then take a gigantic loan against the value of all of these homes. And then they put that money in their pocket. And then the tenants who lived in those homes would then pay back the rent. So that they could either use that money to buy still more homes, which they sometimes did, or they could use it to start some other business venture, get into the hotel business or senior housing or whatever they wanted.
What was the magnitude of this trend, the buying of foreclosed properties and then renting them out? How big was this in scale?
Well, as I said, there's 8 million homes were lost to foreclosure during the Great Recession, and the homeownership rate went down every year over this 8-year period of President Obama being in office. And if you talk to these Wall Street guys like the Blackstones of the world, Tom Barrack, they will say, well, hey, you add all of us Wall Street firms up, we only add up to about 200,000 homes. And that's true. But they're part of this bigger system that you all have documented at Marquette, which is homes going from being owned by families, either a family who lives in it themselves, a homeowner, or a mom and pop landlord who maybe lives right around the corner, to millions of homes being owned by shell companies. And so the latest census figures show that now up to 40% of all rental property in America is owned by shell companies. And people all over the country are dealing with the same problem that you are, which is that a home can be blighted, the rent can be stratospheric, it can be vacant, and the city and the resident don't even know who really owns it if there's a dispute. And it could be a Wall Street firm like Blackstone that I write about in Homewreckers, or it could be a Chinese investor, an Arab investor. It could be a Facebook employee here in California buying houses in Milwaukee. And because they're hiding behind these corporate shells, it can be almost impossible for you, if you live in Milwaukee, to know who your landlord really is.
I want to pursue that further in just a moment, but give us an idea of how profitable this business model is for people. What kinds of sums of money are we talking about that some of the more prominent purchasers of these properties made over time?
Well, they're making a net income of almost 70% month after month. So if they're charging you $2,000 in rent for a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom home, 70% of that is profit. And that doesn't even count the other ways that they make money. Because as I was saying, the main way that they make money is by pooling these properties together, leveraging them, and then getting you, the tenant, to pay back that debt. And so a number of the house that I write about in the book, which is this 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom house, 1,500 square feet in Thousand Oaks, California, just outside of Los Angeles, gets bought for $300,000 in 2013. In 2016, it's leveraged into a $500 million mortgage-backed security by Tom Barrack's company. Tom Barrack is one of the best friends of our current president. He introduced Donald Trump at the Republican National Convention, planned his inauguration. So he pulls $500 million out of this house and a bunch of other houses. Then in 2019, it's leveraged again. By this point, it's owned by Blackstone, which has built up a empire of 70,000 homes, and they turn it into $1 billion mortgage-backed security. So as time goes on and property values rise, these companies are using these homes as a piggy bank. They're withdrawing money out of it and turning it into debt, just like homeowners did in 2005 and 2006 and built a housing bubble. And this right now is what really concerns me, is that we all know what happened with the last housing bubble when there was high unemployment and an economic crisis and declining real estate values. Well, here we are in the COVID pandemic. There's high unemployment. There's a national economic crisis. We haven't yet seen declining real estate values because the Federal Reserve has been propping up the real estate market with low interest rates, and we've had stimulus through the CARES Act. But if that starts to weaken, and the tenants who are living in these homes can't pay rent over an extended period of time, then we're going to see all these debt bubbles that these Wall Street landlords have built burst in the same way that they did in 2008. And we could be looking at a sequel of the crisis that we saw last time.
That would suggest, Aaron, that we didn't learn any lessons from 2008. Would that be fair to say?
Well, we've learned some lessons. You know, it's actually heartening to see, for example, that there's a foreclosure moratorium built into the CARES Act. Another important thing is that the forbearance programs that people can have access to, if you can't pay your mortgage because of the coronavirus pandemic, and you have a loan that is backed or owned by HUD or Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac or the VA or any other part of the federal government, then you can enter into forbearance, which means that you can put off those payments until later. Now, eventually, you're going to have to work that out. Right now, there's 3.5 million American families in forbearance. That's kind of scary. All these millions of Americans who can't make their mortgage payment. But this is also something we learned from 2008, because back then, these families would have simply been mowed down and kicked out. So we've bought ourselves some time, right? What this means is that either the economy is going to come back, or we're going to be in a prolonged recession, and the next president, whether it's Joe Biden or another term of Donald Trump, is really going to have to address what to do about all of these millions of American families who can't pay their mortgage. And this is also something that is really going to affect the dynamics that you all have been writing about in Milwaukee, where there's all these out-of-state landlords, because this crisis is going to hit homeowners hard, but it's also hitting mom and pop landlords extraordinarily hard because of the eviction protection. So if you are a mom and pop landlord and your tenant can't pay rent, you can't evict them and get a new tenant, but you don't have the access to capital in the same way that these big Wall Street landlords like Blackstone have. And so you're starting to see these big Wall Street landlords offer themselves up as saviors to mom and pop landlords. Hey, we'll take that property off your hands. And so if you're sitting in Milwaukee and you're worried about a land grab right now, you not only need to be worried about a land grab, homeowners losing their homes, you also need to worry about, people, mom and pop landlords, people who live in the community and have a stake in the community, losing their rental property and having it sucked up by people who live far away.
So this would have, if this trend continues, could potentially have even more profound consequences for neighborhoods, for example, for that cohesion that comes from people knowing that, hey, we're all in this together. The person next door to me owns his or her home. It has an impact on the kind of community we are.
It's really tough. It's really tough. And also, I think it has an impact on the ability of people to build wealth, especially people of color. We hear a lot of talk in the media about the stock market and how the stock market's doing. Well, guess what? Only about 20% of Americans own any stock at all, right? For Most Americans, 80% of our paycheck every month is spent on just a handful of things: food, clothing, shelter, transportation. The only thing of all of those assets that can actually increase in value over time is our housing dollars. So we're spending anywhere between a third and a half of our paycheck on housing. And either we can pay that in rent, in which case it enriches our landlord, or we can pay it in a mortgage payment, in which case we are building wealth for our family over time. Because all the other things that we spend money on, I mean, our gas is burned up, our clothing wears out, our health insurance premiums we're never going to see again. And that's our income, right? So if you have families who can't own their home and they're paying rent, if they're paying rent not to somebody who lives in that community, but that those dollars are going outside of the community, then it can just be devastating to not only the renting class, but also the upper middle class that previously might have savings in like one or two rental properties.
Yeah, I want to have you address this because you've heard the argument. In fact, you even address it in the book. But the argument is that you hear from some of the folks who are buying multiple properties or hundreds of properties is that they're actually doing a public good, that these were foreclosed homes. They have now stepped into the breach. They have offered people a chance to live in a home, that they're doing something good here, that they're not bad people and that they're not doing anything illegal. What do you say to that?
Well, in terms of the illegal part, a number of these people have been sanctioned at various points. So, for example, the main story of my book is about One West Bank, which was run by a current Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, who became known as the foreclosure king. And subsequent to him becoming the Treasury Secretary, there was an $89 million fraud settlement with this bank, and then a $100 million redlining settlement. So there's some real impropriety here. But separate from that, we're talking about public policy decisions. These individuals didn't just do this out of the goodness of their heart. They were heavily subsidized. They got sweetheart deals with the government. Mnuchin foreclosed on more than 100,000 families, including over 30,000 seniors. And the agreement that he made with the FDIC actually subsidized him for making these foreclosures. So if he foreclosed on a family, he could bill the government for the difference in value between what he was able to sell the home for and the value of the loan. He could also bill the government for his attorney's fees, appraisal costs, inspection costs, all these other costs. And the reason we made this deal was we were worried that we would lose even more money if we didn't. But we paid for this. We could have easily taken that $1 billion that we paid to Mnuchin and spent it on something else to help communities. Same thing with Tom Barrack. He comes in, builds a rental empire of 35,000 homes after the bust, as I write in Homewreckers. But the way he gets started is by buying houses in bulk auctions off of the taxpayers for often 30 cents on the dollar. The federal government, because of the foreclosure epidemic, ends up owning about 200,000 homes. And they could have been sold off to families at discount. They could have been given to cities for affordable housing or nonprofits. In fact, in public comments, many of these suggestions were made to the Obama administration. We could have gone even farther, as I suggest in the book, and adopted what President Roosevelt did during the Great Depression, which was to found a government-run bank to intervene and simply refinance loans of people, and that ended up making a profit for the taxpayers. So this is all very important right now, because the good news is we had this movie, right? We saw this movie. Now we're in the sequel. So it doesn't need to go exactly the same way.
You mentioned a number of the prominent figures in the Trump administration or people with ties to Donald Trump himself. But you also talk about that these deals essentially were done during the Obama era.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned, you kind of talked about this, Aaron, but when they look back on that, will they probably say, gee, there were policy mistakes that were made that we could have, as you suggest, done things differently than the way we did?
Well, certainly many people feel that way. The question is, if Joe Biden is elected president, are those going to be the people who are empowered? And so this is going to be something for people to watch very closely if there's a Biden victory. Is that, in the course of reporting my book, I interviewed many people, some of whom were unapologetic, and others of whom were in the room and warned that all of this would happen and suggested policy alternatives that were different. For example, Alan Blinder, who was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors and a Federal Reserve Board member at various points, he gets in the room with Schumer, Pelosi, and the Obama people and suggests in 2008 that we should have a government-run bank to help rework mortgages and save the day, right? Just like we did in the 1930s. And he points out that the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which Roosevelt founded, refinanced 1 out of every 5 mortgages in urban America, saved 1 million homes, and made a profit for the taxpayers. Is he going to be in the room with those kinds of ideas? Or are we going to have the same people in the room who cut deals with folks like Tom Barrack and Steve Mnuchin? Because they, I think, based on my interviews, I think that they might be predisposed to do the same thing all over again.
Yeah, I was going to sort of bring things back to a Milwaukee perspective, and you write in the book, Aaron, about how certain markets were particularly lucrative, and places like Las Vegas or Phoenix or Atlanta, and not so much places like Cleveland or Detroit or maybe even a Milwaukee. Is that likely to change over time? Does Milwaukee has as much that can be done in some of those other markets I just mentioned been done, and now they look for new opportunities? Is it likely to change our housing market? Are we likely to see more people coming into this and looking at it as a place where they can do business?
Well, you've charted in your research the extremely high concentration of out-of-state landlords. Right. It happens to not involve these Wall Street guys too much. Correct. That I write about in my book. And there are some reasons for that. The first is they don't like winter. Winter means maintenance. Phoenix is great. Weather does not affect buildings in Phoenix hardly at all, at least in the short term. And they want to put as little money into maintenance as possible. Your housing stock is older. They prefer these markets like Phoenix and Vegas, and with the newer housing stock. In a city like Los Angeles, yes, they bought a lot in South Central and older African-American neighborhoods, but they concentrated their buying in the newer exurbs, where the housing stock was newer. So these are some features that they like. They also like cities like Atlanta because they see Atlanta as having strong job growth. And so these are the cities that they're looking at. They want to know that they're going to be able to buy low, charge high rents, and jack it up really, really fast. And so if they don't feel like Milwaukee's economic engine is moving fast enough, then they're not going to want to bet on Milwaukee. So the kind of buyers that you're going to have in Milwaukee are actually in some ways more concerning, because you're having smaller buyers from out of state that may not really understand what they're getting into, that are not professionalized the way these Wall Street firms are, but also don't know the community the way a mom and pop landlord would. And so in some ways, you're getting the worst of both worlds. And as you know, we're suing at Reveal. We filed a lawsuit against the Treasury Department to find out who's behind a lot of these shell companies that are buying up cities like Milwaukee. And my understanding, after doing some research in Philly, which is another city similar to Milwaukee that's attracting these smaller investors, is that you have a lot of people who are just parking their money. And that is extraordinarily concerning, because they might as well be buying like a stock in something, right? They have like really no engagement at all in the property. Where, I've been criticizing these Wall Street landlords. At least the Wall Street landlords have kind of an interest in continuing to make a profit month after month by renting out the property.
And Glantz is the author of this really fascinating book. It's called Homewreckers. Really an important story, and a story that, as you pointed out today, Aaron, continues to play out. We will see what the coming months and years bring in terms of the trends that you've described. Aaron Glantz joining us from San Francisco today. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, and thank you for all your work on this in Milwaukee.
Appreciate it. And now we're going to have a tape presentation from the Lubar Center's research fellow, John Johnson. As Aaron mentioned, John and I have been writing about some of the significant changes in the housing sector in Milwaukee, what they mean for residents and neighborhoods. And so we're going to turn things over right now to John Johnson.
In the last 15 years, Milwaukee's housing has changed dramatically. I'm not referring to the rapid growth of apartment buildings in the North End, Walker's Point, and Bayview, as impressive as those developments are. The bigger changes are harder to see. Many thousands of homes are no longer owner-occupied, and their owners are increasingly not from Milwaukee at all. Consequently, hundreds of millions of dollars of wealth has left the city. By poring over city tax data and state transaction records, I've traced the effects of the Great Recession on Milwaukee's neighborhoods and its long, lingering aftermath. If you spend a little time in Milwaukee, you'll begin to notice a pattern to the shapes and sizes of the houses. Like a tree, Milwaukee's residential neighborhoods spread out in concentric rings around the downtown commercial core. At the center, old walking neighborhoods with incongruous mixes of modest cottages and grand old houses give way to a thick ring of duplexes whose working class occupants commuted on the new streetcars. The prosperity of the Roaring Twenties produced Milwaukee's narrow bungalow belt, and this pattern was repeated in turn with thousands of Cape Cod homes after World War II. By the mid-1950s, tastes had changed. Lot sizes grew and house sizes shrank as around 30,000 ranch homes filled in the city's recently acquired sprawling northwest, southwest, and far south sides. Despite their differences, all these neighborhoods have one basic thing in common. They are all made up of houses. If you live in Milwaukee, you probably live in a house, not an apartment. By houses, I mean single-family homes, duplexes, triplexes, or condominiums, the kinds of places a family might buy to live in. 72% of all Milwaukee residential housing units are these kinds of properties. Even when we include commercial properties, residential houses still constitute 57% of the city's total tax base. They make up 97% of the residential lots in the city, and they hold more than 80% of the city's bedrooms. When we talk about access to safe, affordable, comfortable housing in Milwaukee, we need to remember that for most people, that means a house. Historically, homeownership has been an achievable option for a wide range of incomes. And even if you're a renter, the odds are good that you'll wind up living in a house. About half of Milwaukee's rental units are in a single-family home, a duplex, a triplex, or a condo. This reliance on houses and owner occupancy, even at lower incomes, made Milwaukee particularly vulnerable to the Great Recession. After hovering steadily for years around 79 to 80%, Milwaukee's owner occupancy rate crashed beginning in 2006. The share of houses occupied by their owner fell by about 1 percentage point of the entire housing stock each year until 2012. The decline didn't bottom out until after 2015, and by then the damage was done. These maps show owner occupancy rates in 2005 and 2020. The map in the middle shows the change between these years. Blue indicates better than average, red shows worse than average. Although foreclosures happened all over the city, the effect of the housing crisis was most devastating in the 1st, 2nd, and 7th districts. Owner occupancy in the 1st district fell from 78% in 2005 to 56% in 2020. In 2005, the 2nd district was one of the city's bastions of owner occupancy. At 87% owner-occupied, it ranked fourth among the 15 districts. Now, 15 years and one housing crisis later, just 65% are owner-occupied. Owner occupation in the 7th district fell 20 points, from 74% to 54%. Although owner occupancy rates fell in every aldermanic district, none of the others came close to these 20-plus point drops. As those maps suggested, the housing crisis effect on Black families in Milwaukee was extraordinarily disproportionate. Latino residents have long had slightly higher levels of owner occupancy in Milwaukee than in the average American city. Both in Milwaukee and in US cities as a whole, Latino homeownership has nearly finished rebounding from the Great Recession. In the latest data, 42% of Milwaukee Latinos lived in a house they owned, compared to 36% in cities nationally. While Latino Milwaukeeans matched the national trend for city dwellers, white Milwaukeeans diverged from the national trend for the better. Among white city dwellers nationally, home ownership plummeted from 64% of the population in 2005 to 54% in 2018. But for white Milwaukeeans, home ownership did rebound, recovering to 62% in the most recent data. Black owner occupancy in Milwaukee has lagged the national average since the industrial collapse of the 1980s. And the Great Recession exacerbated this trend. In 2005, 36% of Black Milwaukeeans lived in an owner-occupied house. Now, 28% do. On the one hand, Latino and non-Hispanic white Milwaukeeans have recovered strongly from the housing crisis. Their rates of homeownership significantly exceed the US city average, suggesting that they have successfully taken advantage of the city's relatively low home prices. The experience of Black Milwaukeeans has been the exact opposite. In total, the number of non-owner-occupied properties in Milwaukee has increased by 15,000 since 2005. The bulk of this increase has gone to landlords with addresses outside Milwaukee, including a growing share of landlords from beyond Wisconsin altogether. The share of landlord-held properties owned by someone with a Milwaukee address declined from 62% in 2005 to 48% in 2020. Landlords based in the suburbs now own 30% of Milwaukee's rental stock, but the fastest growth has come among landlords who list their address somewhere outside Wisconsin. In 2005, they owned 4% of the city's rented houses. Now they own 13%, worth over $620 million in the latest tax assessments. Using the Census Bureau's estimates for median contract rent and assuming a vacancy rate of 7%, I estimate that Milwaukee renters are collectively paying around $65 million to landlords outside Wisconsin each year. This figure ranges from a low of $1.1 million in the 13th district to a high of $8.8 million in the 7th district. Figures for suburban-based landlords are even higher. I estimate that they collect as much as $160 million each year from Milwaukee renters. One puzzle is that the number of properties owned by out-of-state landlords has kept growing in the last few years, even as the housing crisis, though not its effects, has abated. Foreclosures have declined to pre-crisis levels, and the owner occupancy rate has stabilized. So far, we fortunately haven't seen any changes to these positive trends in 2020. But still, out-of-state landlords have continued to acquire properties. They began with 1,200 in 2005, reached 2,600 in 2010, 4,200 in 2015, and now they currently hold about 5,600 properties in the fall of 2020. So where are they getting them from? The second graph on this slide gives us a clue. In it, I identify the year when each property was acquired by an out-of-state owner. Then I identify the ownership status of the property in the previous year. Throughout the housing crisis, out-of-state buyers made a killing off distressed owner-occupiers. At the peak of the recession, they were acquiring 500 to 800 previously owner-occupied properties a year. Now that there are fewer distressed owner-occupiers, this has become a less fruitful source. But rather than ceasing to buy up Milwaukee's low-cost housing, out-of-state buyers have instead switched to acquiring properties owned by Milwaukee and Milwaukee suburb-based landlords. In 2018, out-of-state buyers bought about 300 houses that were owner-occupied in 2017, an additional 300 that were owned by a Milwaukee landlord, and 200 more that were owned by a landlord in the suburbs. Figuring out who exactly owns these properties is extremely challenging because a rapidly decreasing share of the properties are actually owned directly by a real live human being. LLCs didn't exist in Wisconsin until 1994, and since then their popularity has steadily grown. Today, over 11,000 houses are owned by an LLC in Milwaukee. This form of ownership is popular with all kinds of landlords, but it is especially common among the new breed of out-of-state landlords. As Aaron Glantz details in his book Homewreckers, the early years of the housing crisis were a wild west of shady investors and opportunist entrepreneurs, along with a handful of lucky home buyers, scraping up the mess created by the financial system's failures. Some of those investor buyers just wanted to buy low and sell high. Others saw an opportunity to create a new class of investment, portfolios of single-family home rentals. The big-time investors Glantz profiles liked to buy houses in metro areas with growing populations so as to drive up rents, as well as warm climates and new housing stock so as to minimize maintenance costs. Milwaukee, along with most Rust Belt cities, fails on all three counts. But if the largest investment players passed over Milwaukee, smaller fish with money to invest were ready to take their place. As the dust settles from the housing crisis, there are signs that a model of absentee-owned residential property as capital investment is emerging. As Glantz discusses at length, many of these new property owners are deliberately difficult, even impossible to identify. But I'll end my discussion today by briefly describing one landlord who has recently entered Milwaukee's market, someone who I think illustrates these emerging trends. Beginning in December 2017, a buyer named Ing Properties began rapidly acquiring Milwaukee homes. They use three different LLCs, Ing Properties 1, and Ing Properties 2. Altogether, so far they've purchased over 70 houses in Milwaukee, each of which is shown on this map, along with one more in Waukesha. In total, they've spent nearly $6 million on properties with an average value of about $60,000. None of their purchases were from owner-occupiers, and many of their transactions clearly involved multiple properties. I'm going to describe their transactions in a little bit of detail because I think they illustrate the different ways that this can take place in a city like Milwaukee. They paid three different LLCs located at the same address in Chicago a little over $1 million across 12 transactions. The address of these LLCs is a co-working space on Michigan Avenue. I identified 6 different LLCs located at this address who've purchased and sold property in Milwaukee beginning no earlier than 2017. Ing Properties spent over $2 million in 2 transactions with Asium LLC, an entity with an address in Bloomingdale, Illinois. I found strangely little information about Asium online, and they are absent from the Milwaukee end-of-year property records, suggesting that they held the houses Ing Properties bought for a very short amount of time. Ing Properties also spent $1.2 million in one transaction buying properties from a longtime Milwaukee landlord who started acquiring properties around 2000. One of the ways that you can tell this is a more traditional old school landlord is that he owns all of his properties under his own name. Ing Properties paid a collection of LLCs with a shared address on Capitol Drive in Milwaukee $919,000. All of these LLCs began activities during the housing crisis. The remainder of Ing's purchases were from actual individuals from the Milwaukee suburbs who property records show began acquiring houses during the peak of the crisis. All told, Ing Properties acquired its 70-odd homes from a variety of sources. Some were bought from a longtime Milwaukee landlord. Others were from local people who saw an opportunity to buy cheap houses during the recession. and still others are from opaque, out-of-state LLCs, which themselves appear to have bundled these properties for resale. In all cases, it seems likely to me that none of these houses were listed on the retail housing market. A prospective home buyer in these neighborhoods likely wouldn't have ever had the opportunity to purchase one of these houses. As I did this research, I was surprised to realize that I can see one of Ing Properties' houses from the window in my home office where I'm currently recording this video. I can't say for sure who the ultimate owner or owners of Ing Properties is or are, but each transaction lists an owner's address and an upscale townhouse in Arlington, Virginia. That address is also associated with an older business, a DC area chauffeur service. I don't know what kind of landlord Ing Properties is, but their network of LLCs have filed 29 evictions since entering the Milwaukee market, including 6 since July. Despite the severe economic damage already done by the COVID-19 pandemic, overall homeownership in Milwaukee has held steady in 2020 so far. A second housing crisis has not begun, at least not yet. But either way, we are still living with the consequences of the last one. 15,000 fewer homes are owner-occupied now than were a decade and a half ago. And a rapidly increasing number of homes are owned by obscure business entities with no seeming connection to Milwaukee except on their balance sheet.
Thanks a lot, John. And now let's get some feedback on what we've seen and heard from the president of the Milwaukee Common Council, Cavalier Johnson. He is a native Milwaukeean, a UW-Madison graduate, first elected to the Common Council back in 2016, represents the northwest side of Milwaukee, the second aldermanic district, and he was elected president of the Common Council in April of this year. President Johnson, good to have you with us today.
Hey, Mikey, thank you for having me, Mike. I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, me too. And thanks for being with us. Let's just get a couple of initial thoughts from you about what you've seen and heard from Aaron Glantz and from John Johnson.
Well, actually, before you called on me to do this interview, I did look at earlier this year the Journal Sentinel piece that you and John had written regarding the trends of home ownership in Milwaukee. And I can tell you from being an alderman in the second district, and I know that John mentioned this in his presentation about the second district being a bastion of stability in home ownership, that we see some of those trends on the ground. You see the trends of properties in neighborhoods in our district and throughout our city that are not owned by people who live here or people who live even in our surrounding community or in our state. And that causes problems, right? It causes problems with stability. It causes problems in terms of neighbors being able to know who actually owns the property next door to them. It causes problems with the landlords, whether they're individuals or LLCs, more likely, sticking any old body in there without doing any sort of background checks or any research to see that the folks that they're putting into their properties are going to add to the fabric of neighborhoods. And that ultimately affects, again, the stability and the cohesiveness of neighborhoods. And that is trouble.
Yeah, you live in the area not far from John Marshall High School. So this is, not too far from 64th and Febrance, right off of Capitol. You talk about, you can see this, you can feel it in terms of how a community feels. Give me more specific examples of that. What it is like living in a community where you're starting to see things change.
Yeah, I mean, all you had to do is just take a snapshot of the call logs that we get in our office regarding some of these properties. And we get calls, I mean, in this office, not just from my constituents, but we get calls from people all over the city. And we get a lot of calls from folks who live on the south side too, because I'm the second district alderman, and folks who live in the second police district sometimes mistake that, and they shoot us a call thinking that we're the elected official.
You're the president. You have to solve all the problems. So that's your job. That comes with the territory.
Yeah, and I try my best,
right.
But I mean, yeah, I mean, we see this every single day with the calls that come into our office, and like I said, you could just take a snapshot and hear the frustration of people who have owned their properties for 10, 15, 20 years, and now some properties in their neighborhoods are owned by these entities that are nameless and faceless, and they can't make a point of contact, and the people who are in there are inapproachable, and they can't even reach out and talk to the landlord in order to get some sort of compromise about what should be done about what's happening in their neighborhood, on their block, and that has a tremendous effect on their quality of life. So like I said, we see this all the time, and it's difficult for us to be in a position of trying to track down who owns these properties, especially when it's an LLC, especially when it's some entity that is out of state. And from what we've seen, in our district and elsewhere, it's again not just individuals in our surrounding communities. It's folks in California and in Texas, in Georgia, and New York, by and large, that own a lot of these properties that change hands from once upon a time homeowner occupied properties to these investor occupied properties.
There's a whole nother part to this equation besides the issue of maintenance or responsiveness or some of the concerns that you laid out, and that is the transfer of wealth. One of the things that jumped out at me in John's presentation was the amount of money paid in rent to out-of-state firms or to suburban landlords. I think it was $65 million to out-of-state firms and $160 million to suburban landlords. That's money from the city of Milwaukee being transferred outside the city. That surely has to concern you.
It certainly does. I mean, whether it's in terms of rent, whether it's in terms of the state action that got rid of our 75-year-old residency requirement for employees to live in the city, which many employees move out. We've got literally half of our police force that lives in surrounding communities. No longer are they in our neighborhoods, getting to know the people that they come in to police and helping to stabilize the neighborhoods that they protect and serve. But we see these issues, we face these issues, and it's tens of millions and sometimes over hundreds of millions of dollars that is a wealth transfer out of the city of Milwaukee to these other communities. Not to mention too, the issue around shared revenue, where the city of Milwaukee is subsidizing essentially surrounding communities, not just here, but around the state. So there's a lot of money that's flowing out of Milwaukee to the benefit of other communities, not just here, but elsewhere around the country. And, we should be doing all that we can. And it'd be nice if we had partners at the state level to help us to do this, to make sure that a lot of that money stays in place, stays here in Milwaukee, so that we can help to make sure that our neighborhoods are strong and secure and stable.
Let's talk for a moment then about what can be done at a local policy level. If perhaps you're not going to get help at the state level, what can be done locally? And I guess, I should begin by saying, let's give credit where credit is due. My understanding is that there is special vetting of people who want to make bulk housing purchases, people who are interested in buying many homes, that there are people that the city won't sell to, knowing based their track record. There are some things in place, but surely as a representative of the city, you would like to see more owner occupancy. You would like to see more city residents owning their own properties rather than renting from people who don't live in the city. How do you do that?
Absolutely. And, that's something that, I'm certainly the mayor and every other member of the Common Council does support. We know the benefits of owner occupancy in our neighborhoods. It does all those things that we were just talking about, right? It helps to stabilize neighborhoods, which makes them stronger, which makes them safer, which eases the burden and responsibility of police too, because if they go into neighborhoods that are organized and stabilized, then it's less likely that they're going to have to enter those communities to answer, some of these calls that police, typically, end up having to answer that we see on the evening news. To me, at the local level, there are a number of things that we have worked on over the course of the past number of years. After the housing crisis in 2008, there was the Strong Neighborhoods plan that was developed. And so we work to make sure that people who are owner occupants of property in our city have access to forgivable loans in order to make needed repairs, In recent years, there's been a push to try to make sure there's a fund to help stabilize taxes for people who live in areas near and around downtown that has seen a lot of investment, which causes their property taxes to spike. And we're trying to make sure that those folks who have weathered the storm, over these years don't get, priced out of their own neighborhoods. The mayor tried to coalesce a number of programs starting in 2018 with this 10,000 homes initiative to build up or improve, or to build up new properties, to improve existing properties, or to help, should I say, people to become first-time homeowners in the city of Milwaukee. And we've seen some successes with that. One of the things that we've seen as well is the creation of the Mary program that you referenced, Mike, where there are a cluster of city-owned tax foreclosed properties that we sell to developers for a reduced price, with the goal to have those developers to go in to renovate those homes, taking away the blight that's in our neighborhoods, and selling those properties then to owner occupants in our city, which does exactly what we're talking about, increasing the number of owner occupancy in our neighborhoods. One of the things that I've been supportive of and have been trying to work out the kinks with the Department of City Development is to try to have our own sort of investor program where we have local landlords, right? If there are city properties that are for sale, let's try to give a leg up to people who live in our neighborhoods, who are longtime owner occupants, who live with and see these distressed properties, day after day, year after year. Let's give them the opportunity to purchase these properties and be investors who live in the neighborhood, keeping some of that wealth, the tens of millions and over hundreds of millions of dollars that we're talking about that leaves our city and leaves our state. Let's talk about keeping that money here. And I think a program like that could help to turn the tide on that.
How do you do that, President Johnson? Because that one of the things that we've found is that you're starting to see more landlords in Milwaukee selling their properties directly to these out-of-state landlords who are making them an offer, I guess, that they can't refuse. How do you jump in and get ahead in the line of these out-of-state investors, these out-of-state property buyers? And how do you get Milwaukee residents first shot at some of these properties?
Well, on the properties that the city of Milwaukee owns, ourselves, that we've acquired via tax foreclosure, it's an easier process, right? Sure. But for individual private sales, that becomes more of an issue. Right. And we would need, I think, some assistance from the state in order to intervene to a significant degree when they're making these sales to these larger entities that are trying to purchase a number of properties to pad their portfolio of housing stock. So we would need the state, I believe, to step in to help us in order to do that, especially if some of these organizations have a rap sheet of maintenance issues, not following up with issues that the Department of Neighborhood Services has hit them on, and the like. So there are some things that we can do with the properties that we have in our own possession, but when it comes to private sales, I mean that's a whole nother animal.
Yeah. Are you worried about what happens now? We are in the midst of a pandemic still. We have people who are either unemployed or just trying to hang on until things get better. Are you concerned about what that does to the housing situation in Milwaukee? Are you concerned that there will be some people who, again, may look to sell to somebody offering them a price at this moment just because they feel a sense of desperation?
Yeah, I really am. I mean, after looking at the trends that have been happening in our city, from your reporting from 2005 to the present, especially after the Great Recession and the housing crisis that ensued, and looking at the trends even now, of these larger entities coming in, scooping up these properties at a really low price, taking out a loan against it to put in their pockets or to do whatever else with that money, and then sticking the folks on the ground to pay the bill. My concern is that we're creating a another bubble that potentially is going to end up popping and then having a devastating effect on people who live in the city of Milwaukee, particularly those folks who are most vulnerable, be they Black, brown, seniors, low income, and the like. That's what my concern is.
How challenging is it right now to undertake some of these initiatives that would increase home ownership, owner occupancy? How difficult is it to do that right now, given the current budget situation that the city of Milwaukee faces? Is there room for new initiatives given some of the hard realities that face the city of Milwaukee?
Well, whether it's new initiatives around this, or something as rudimentary as paying for critical services, essential services like police or fire, or making sure that we do our pension obligation. Our ability to do those things is severely hampered by state action. The city of Milwaukee, unlike every other major metropolitan area, every other major city in the country, does not have the ability to levy a local tax to help out with the issues that we see in our community. Our ability to raise the funds from the property stock that we have here is capped by property tax levies implemented by the state. And our shared revenue dollars from the state of Wisconsin have been flat or dwindling for the better part of 20 years. So whether it's this or anything else, we face a really difficult road in order to make the investments that we need to spruce up, something like this. It is good to know that in the proposed budget, the mayor has identified some money, I believe $6.5 million from a tax incremental district that's closing out, to invest that money into housing programs, which I think is great for us to be able to do, to look at doing something around these community land trusts to help people with their down payments to purchase homes. And we could potentially affect 200 families and 200 home purchases and the like doing that. So we would love to do much more, but unfortunately, due to the financial structure that we're under in the state of Wisconsin, we're very limited in what we can do.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. That's a good point. I'm glad you raised that. You have this TIF district, I guess the Beer Line or Commerce Street district, where there is some money left, and so you can provide down payments essentially for 200 families. That's pretty innovative in a challenging time, I would say.
Yeah, it is. And again, we would be interested in doing much more, but the fact of the matter is that, look, our budget is stretched, and it's not that we don't want to find other ways to make investments in our communities, because people are clearly asking for those things, right? The problem that we see is that our funding mechanism, our fiscal soundness, is completely out of our control. We don't have the ability to, in a substantial way, change that dynamic. We would need the state to step in order to help us make those changes.
I'll let you look into the future here for our final question is, take us 10 years out. We have seen these trends emerge since the Great Recession, essentially since even before the Great Recession, 2005. And we see this decline in owner occupancy, this increase in properties owned by people who don't live in the city. Take us 10 years out. Are you optimistic that trend will abate? Are you optimistic that we will see greater owner occupancy return? How does it look to you sitting there today?
Well, as I use the crystal ball and look 10 years into the future, I look at some of the investments that have happened, public as well as private, in the central part of our city and downtown. And my thought is that, those things will, trickle out into the neighborhoods, over time. We're already, again, trying to use funding that's happened in a more prosperous part of Milwaukee and to make investments, just like we were just talking about, in other neighborhoods throughout the city. So we'll continue to work at those things over the course of the next 10 years. And given an opportunity to reset the relationship with the state legislature, if that provides an opportunity for us to open up more dollars, for us to make these sort of investments, then we're going to be all over the opportunity to make sure that people from all stripes and all income levels have access to quality, affordable housing in all of our neighborhoods, all across the entire city of Milwaukee. So I am optimistic about this, but I'm not going to sugarcoat it and say that it's going to happen overnight or without challenges or hiccups, be they political or otherwise, that we have to get through in order to make them happen.
Before we go, bring us up to date on, as you understand it, as a representative of the second aldermanic district, how big a problem? Well, there've been some help for evictions right now, but I'm wondering how big a problem do you think that could be? What are you hearing from people in your district?
Well, if there were not the assistance that were provided by Governor Evers with the Wisconsin Rental Assistance Program, and followed up with additional assistance provided by Milwaukee County and the County Executive Crowley's administration, and work done by the City of Milwaukee, the county's portion and the city's portion to the tune of several millions of dollars, we would be in a really rough position, I think, in terms of evictions. Look, in my district, on the northwest side of Milwaukee, there are a lot of apartments. I think there's a deceptively large amount of apartments that folks probably don't even realize. We've got a lot of housing stock, many single family homes, of course, but there are a ton of apartments. And many of those apartments are owned by a entity here in Milwaukee that accounts for the vast majority of evictions that we see on an annual basis and have for the past number of years. So were it not for those programs being in place, were it not for the governor's program, the county executive's program, the city's program around rental assistance, in the second district, I think we would see a lot of turnover in a lot of properties from end to end. So I'm very grateful on behalf of my constituents that those programs are there to help them.
Yeah. The president of the Milwaukee Common Council, Cavalier Johnson, we enjoyed the visit today. Thanks very much for being with us. And I also want to thank our previous guests, Aaron Glantz from Reveal and John Johnson, the Lubar Center Research Fellow. Thanks to the three of you for joining us today. And thanks to everybody who's watching out there. We appreciate your time and interest, and we will see you next time on The Issues. Thanks.